King Henry VIII executed over 72,000 enemies during his reign, yet he remained defenseless against a shadowy assassin that attacked his innermost court of rich and powerful noblemen with impunity, striking his advisers with a paralyzing physical dread and death within hours. To this day, the killer has never been identified, despite striking thousands in every generation of the Tudor dynasty until vanishing mysteriously by the end of the Tudor line. The Curse of the English Sweat, tonight on Ominous and Grim.
I'm Mr. Ominous.
And I'm Dr. Grim, covering shocking histories
and darkest mystery.
From the undeniable facts
to personal experience, our channel covers all things ominous
and grim. I'm Dr. Grim, and tonight we're going back in time to England in 1485, the year that the Tudor dynasty of monarchs was established by future King Henry VII through killing former King Richard III in the Battle of Bosworth Field. However, the star of tonight's story is not about these powerful humans and their political conflicts, but about an invisible assassin that rises up to follow and slay them all, a most sinister and shadowy kind of plague that will come to be called the English Sweat and many other names. By a series of ominous coincidences, this assassin will be forever associated with the rise and fall of the Tudor dynasty, as its first entrance is mere days after the Battle of Bosworth, where Henry Tudor, soon to be crowned Henry VII, has just hewn down the former King of England, Richard III. Immediately after this battle and coronation, an entirely unknown mystery disease sweeps through London, almost as if it were the retribution of a ghostly assassin. This sneaky assassin is more often fatal than survived, takes mere hours to kill, has no developed immunity, and seems to break all normal rules of disease. As if hunting well-born rulers, it prefers country to town and healthy men in their primes over others, and perhaps most ominous of all, it fills its victims with a physical sensation of supernatural dread and doom as its first symptom. It springs up every 15 to 20 years, roughly generationally, until it finally leaves the stage of history in the same mysterious manner that it came, arriving with the first Tudor monarch, and gone by the accession of the last, Queen Elizabeth I, who then chooses not to marry or bear children, deliberately ending the Tudor line as the Virgin Queen. In similar fashion, the curse of the English sweat also disappears from the world stage at the same time as Queen Elizabeth's choice, without an exact nature of the disease ever being conclusively established. So, before we delve into the grim details, let me issue this warning. Certain passages in this episode could be considered graphic or disturbing if you are a sensitive soul, or it could be exactly your taste in morbid curiosity. If you are repelled by ghastly medical details, you'll want to listen to something else. But if you are attracted to grim detail, that's precisely what we aim to provide. So enjoy, and don't say we didn't warn you. If you're a fan of shocking history and dark mystery, you've come to the right place. Find our next episode on your platform by following this podcast. Share it with a friend and give us a review. Join a community of avid listeners at ominousandgrim.com for bonus content and benefits. That's ominousandgrym.com. And now, back to our story. The English sweat had 5 major outbreaks in 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, and finally 1551. which meant that 3 of the 5 outbreaks occurred just before and within the reign of the most dramatic of the Tudor monarchs, King Henry VIII, who had good reason to fear that the English sweat was out to get him personally. Unlike other diseases of London, the English sweat positively avoids the poor people that populate the slums of London, instead striking down the rich and members of religious orders, and almost exclusively the English-born. This is how it earned the nickname, the English sweat. It also affected men more than women, and struck not in winter, but during the temperate English summer and autumn months. During these outbreaks, the disease was unusually contagious, jumping from person to person with relative ease, although modern experts cannot be certain whether the sweating sickness did pass between people as believed at the time, or if it was in fact transmitted through the population in some other way. The English sweat would strike with extreme speed. It began suddenly, out of the blue, starting with an intense visceral feeling of terror and fear, even of extreme panic, as if something horrible were about to happen that the victim could not put a finger on. We'll want to remember this, as it may be a clue to the physical nature of this particular curse or disease. And Henry VIII and his rich courtiers would be well aware of just how deadly the English sweat would be, enhancing the initial onset of visceral panic with a good underlying reason to feel that panic, as it meant that the victim was very seriously ill and would probably be dead in just a few short hours. But only after a few quick stages were first endured. The victims usually had no rash or other marks to indicate that they had contracted a disease. The sick person's skin remained clear and untouched. At this first stage of the disease, they just felt a horrible dread that something had gone terribly wrong. It all began with just a feeling, albeit an unusually strong one. Within minutes of being overtaken by a sense of impending doom, came a phase of extreme shivering and shaking, as if the victim were freezing to death, even in the middle of a heat wave. This cold, shivery stage would last anywhere from 1 hour to several hours, typically around 3. Fast on the heels of the violent shivering came wave after wave of dizziness. Severe pains would shoot up the neck into the head, causing a headache that would sometimes blind the victim. Next, the pains attacked the arms, then the legs, and finally would rack the whole of the body. At this point, the cold shivers would completely flip, with the victim feeling intense heat instead of the chills, and this is the phase which gives the English sweat its name, as the victim begins at this point to sweat profusely, prodigiously. This sweating phase usually caused a great thirst for water or other drink, perhaps the body's attempt to replenish the fluids rapidly being lost as sweat. A few hours of this sweating would leave the victim utterly exhausted, with a crushing fatigue that rendered the victim helpless, as it was both a mental and physical exhaustion. At this point, the victim is no longer able to stand and becomes bedridden from the exhaustion. The heart pounds very rapidly, sometimes with an irregular and uncomfortable rhythm, depending upon the overall cardio health of the patient. Some victims report being tormented with agonizing, stabbing-like pains in the chest. Unable to withstand the rapid onslaught of this disease, the victim quickly passes from the sweating, exhausted, bedridden stage into a stage of delirium. Accounts emphasize how many victims experienced horrific hallucinations while delirious in this stage, such as being attacked and eaten by bugs or tortured by demons. One can certainly understand how ominous these inexplicably grim facts would be to their Renaissance victims some 50 to 100 years before the first microscope was even invented, much less germ theory. Given the strange preference of this disease for the well-born, such as would fill the court of Henry VIII, and the strange appearance of this never-before-seen disease with the accession of the Tudor dynasty, it makes sense, in a way, that it would be seen as a divine curse upon the Tudors, and why Henry VIII would take extreme measures to try and protect himself from it. Finally, in any case, the victim is overcome by a kind of drowsiness and begins to gasp for air. If this stage is reached, the victim would usually slip into a coma and quickly die. If a victim was fortunate enough to live through the first 24 hours of the disease, however, they would usually survive, but those who did not would often die in as little as 3 hours from a completely unsuspecting start to their last gasp. The lucky ones that survived their first illness were not so lucky as to receive any immunity at all to the sweating disease. It could and did strike the same person again and again. One of Henry VIII's closest advisors, Cardinal Wolsey, is one such case, having been stricken with the curse of the English sweat multiple times. This aspect caused Henry's close advisor Thomas More to write, "One is safer on the battlefield than in the city," an eerily ironic statement, given that the English sweat made its world debut immediately after the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, where King Henry's father, Henry VII, ensured the accession of the Tudor dynasty to the throne by killing King Richard III in battle. Which is all to say that some victims of the English sweat did not live to tell the tale the second and third time they got sick, even after surviving one or more earlier bouts. Medical professionals of the day had absolutely no explanation for the mysterious nature of this disease. What exactly was it? Where did it come from? How did it pass from person to person? These were all unknowns. Understandably, effective medical treatment was therefore also a mystery, since no one was really clear about what was actually happening to the victims. Contemporary physicians of the day did observe that babies and young children did not get sick, yet another anti-pattern for known diseases of the time, which typically target the weaker members of the population. By the time a child reached adolescence, or the early teenage years, this immunity of childhood seemed to disappear. Physicians of the day were well aware of the connection between squalid conditions and most diseases, and yet, in this case, the rich and well-educated people, such as the clergy, that got sick did not live in squalid and filthy surroundings that usually bred disease. Furthermore, the victims were almost always better nourished than the starving, but unaffected, poor. They didn't wear flea and lice-infested rags like Britain's more unfortunate citizens. All of those aspects seemed almost to protect against this disease, whereas the aspects that usually protect against disease, in this case, seem to make it more likely. In the absence of definite medical explanations for this disease, society focused instead on the social determinants of this strange affliction. Over time, the English sweat earned more pointed names, such as the stoop gallant, because of the way it forced the gallant or the proud rich down into a humble state of sickness and helplessness, as if it were a kind of just providence or curse from on high against the wickedness of the rich and powerful. This name also reflected the fact that young rich men were usually the ones affected by the dread and death of the English sweat. Notably to the Tudor connection, this included the death of Henry VIII's 15-year-old brother, Arthur. Arthur was supposed to be the heir to the throne of England, but the sweating sickness killed him suddenly, leaving behind his young bride, Catherine of Aragon, whom Henry VIII would then marry. In some ways, then, the curse of the English sweat is what put Henry VIII upon the throne and gave him his queen. And it is no wonder, then, that he would take extreme steps to protect himself from getting the disease whenever it arrived, spending one entire year keeping his court on the move and never sleeping in the same bed twice, in an effort to avoid getting assassinated by the English sweat, as exactly what did happen to his older brother. At the time, typical speculations as to the cause of the English sweat or stoop gallant pointed to the usual suspects: unsanitary practices and dealing with raw sewage, despite the facts pointing away from such a correlation. Contemporary accounts did note a correlation with wet summers when there was abundant rainfall, and yet others blamed recent wars or large public gatherings, such as when many of the British people gathered for Henry VII's royal coronation ceremony in October of 1485, just after the Battle of Bosworth Fields. Modern medical speculations abound, typically leaning toward the English sweat being a previously unknown hantavirus, which is a virus transmitted by rodents, or even anthrax. But it is important to note that the many modern speculations are no more definitive than the contemporary speculations. The contemporary speculations of the time suffered for their own lack of general knowledge of diseases such as germ theory. While modern speculations have that framework of germ theory, they are in a vacuum of modern evidence to test their theories against. The disease, or curse, or whatever it was, having mysteriously disappeared in the second half of the 1500s. During the reign of King Henry VIII, the disease certainly progressed rapidly through the population, killing over 2,000 people in just a few days. People were justifiably terrified, retreating to their houses with fear holding them prisoner. Doctors of the time advised many preventatives to keep away the sweating sickness. Some claimed eating fresh foods were healthy, while foods past their peak caused the dreaded disease. Fresh air was also advised, as well as plenty of outdoor exercise. However, if you were already sick, the outdoor air was considered unhealthy and one should not go out. This was rather cynical advice, given that the stricken were not likely to be able to stand, much less take fresh air. For the healthy, breathing stagnant or air polluted with bad smells supposedly would bring on the sweating sickness. The night air was also considered unhealthy, especially if a thick fog lay over the land. Classic advice claimed that certain valuable jewels had the power to keep one safe from the sweating sickness, and a thriving trade sprung up to fill this demand. No doubt this was effective marketing, given the demographic preferences of the English sweat for the well-to-do. Herbal cures were very popular, and each doctor or wise woman usually had their own mixture they used to cure the sick. Also, besides drinking an herbal potion, many people burned herbs in their houses to purify the air and help heal the sick. King Henry was no different than his subjects. He quickly summoned the best medical help in the country to his court, sparing no expense. He insisted on being examined every day by his personal medical team, searching for the faintest appearance of the dreaded sweating sickness. Henry also devised assorted ointments and herbal cures, which he wrote down in a book for his own personal use. These he brewed himself and kept bottles locked up in his living quarters. Occasionally he would dose himself with these potions when he felt unwell. Typical to the well-educated of the time, Henry also used astrology, in this case to try and predict his medical future in relation to the sweating sickness now sweeping the country. Henry was a very athletic man by nature, at over 6 feet, with a 32-inch waist and a 54-inch chest in his youthful fighting trim, a very solid kind of build. Any sort of illness evidently terrified Henry, who in his younger years played a lot of tennis and energetic horse riding to keep himself trim and fit and healthy. Unfortunately, at age 44, the large king injured himself severely in a jousting tournament, getting thrown from his horse in full armor, with his fully armored horse also falling and crushing his legs. The wound in his thigh never healed properly from that day onward, and was quite probably the cause of his later obesity and eventual death. Since the king continued to eat prodigiously as his previous athletic lifestyle demanded, but which his later disability would no longer support. As an adult, Henry's reaction to an outbreak of the English sweat was to pack up and leave London as quickly as possible. It started when one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting became sick. Henry had, of course, witnessed firsthand the awful suffering caused by the sweating sickness when his own brother, the Crown Prince Arthur, died horribly in front of him, described at the time to have been caused by a bad vapor in the air. He knew then that the curse of the English sweat which followed the Tudor line was a fate he would go to endless lengths to cheat. When the English sweat roamed the land, Henry kept on the move constantly to stay well ahead of it. Before leaving one spot for another, Henry sent soldiers ahead to investigate if sickness lurked anywhere in the area. One of the unique benefits Henry had as the king is that his noble subjects or vassals were required to put him up and pay his expenses as he roamed his lands. Henry took full advantage of this requirement in service to his paranoia to outrun the English sweat, moving every night from house to house all throughout the warm season in the hope that he would outrun the sweating sickness. He may have actually done the right thing because he did not get sick, while others around him all fell ill and died. Any of Henry's subjects that had enough money and resources to leave the city and travel to the countryside immediately followed the king's example and left London. The king's future wife, Anne Boleyn, however, did not go with her royal lover when he left London. She went instead to her family's residence at Hever Castle. Sure enough, while staying with her family, Anne became ill with the sweating sickness. Her father also got sick, and another close family member died. The thought of the deadly illness striking so close to the throne terrified Henry. Fearing for the life of his precious Anne, he nevertheless stayed far away from her during her desperate illness, even though she lay in her bed in Hever Castle close to death. Instead, Henry wrote his suffering mistress a tender and affectionate love letter and sent it to her, but he would not go near her out of fear. In addition to the love letter, Henry sent more concrete aid in the form of his favorite physician, Dr. Butts, who attended Anne and her father. Eventually, both father and daughter did get well. Overjoyed with his mistress and future father-in-law's recovery, Henry awarded the good Dr. Butts with a very generous salary. Henry also granted him the exalted position of the royal physician for his success. It was usually not the norm for a woman to fall sick with a sweating sickness, and Henry noted this in his letter to his wife. After her full recovery, he sent her many gifts, but did not reunite with her until after a full month had passed. Another testament of the good doctor's luck or skill is that several other famous and well-known people died of this disease on the same day. Henry Brandon, the second Duke of Suffolk, died at the age of 15, along with his brother Charles, aged 13. Both died tragically within an hour of each other, both lying in the same bed. Thomas Cromwell's wife Elizabeth and two of his daughters also died, but in this case in different years. Burial practices of the time for the victims of the English sweat demanded that the dead be buried immediately, with no funerals or public periods of mourning allowed. By 1528, the sweating sickness seemed to have mutated as it changed its deadly course. After devastating the population of London, the disease moved on into the countryside as well, and from there onward to the rest of Europe, killing many as it went. The royal court of England disbanded, and the aristocrats fled to the country for safety once again. Perhaps because the curse of the English sweat brooked no scientific or reasonable explanations at the time, and then again mutated its pattern to deny the psychology any safety in dealing with this disease as some kind of known quantity, the disease naturally encouraged a spread of superstitious fear. Some believe the sweating sickness was sent by God to punish the wicked, or at least the Tudors. In its newly mutated form, the English sweat now spread as far as Poland, Switzerland, Norway, Russia, and Amsterdam. This was the first time the disease had traveled so far. After the warm weather ended that fateful year and the winter began, the sweating sickness once more disappeared back into the shadows from whence it came. This time, however, there was a different outcome, a final surprise, in that the disease vanished from the face of the earth, never to return. This, of course, leaves only our modern speculations to further speculate upon. Modern medical professionals tend to favor the theory that the sweating sickness was a form of the deadly hantavirus. Also known as the hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, its symptoms are similar to those of the mysterious sweating sickness. Hantavirus outbreaks have occurred in the United States in recent years. It's known for killing its victims swiftly and for its high mortality rate. However, the hantavirus is spread by rats through their feces and urine, and not from person to person. The sweating sickness, on the other hand, was believed to be spread by human contact. It primarily struck down the rich, who did not usually live in rat-infested lodgings. Living conditions in Tudor times were more primitive than our standards today, but there was a huge difference between the living conditions of the wealthy and those of the poor, especially in the court of Henry VIII, who insisted on a certain amount of cleanliness and rodent-free housing. As a kind of Renaissance health nut, Henry didn't tolerate filthy or unhygienic surroundings because he thought they caused disease, and he was terrified of disease. So why did the sweating sickness strike his cleaner-than-usual court so hard? Why was the disease more rampant in the city? Because the people lived so close together? But if the disease was transmitted only by rats and not human contact, would that even matter? Another disease, similar to the English sweating sickness, that appeared later in the historical record was called the Picardy sweat. First appearing in 1718, the Picardy sweat had two forms, a milder illness and a more severe sickness. The Picardy sweat did cause heavy sweating, headache, and heart problems, just like the English sweating sickness. However, victims of this disease bled from the nose and developed a distinctive heat-like rash that later caused the affected skin to peel away. These are things that did not happen with the English sweat. The last outbreak of the Picardy sweat occurred in 1906, before it too vanished, like the English sweating sickness. In the final analysis, we may never know more than we do now about the curse of the English sweat, and why the Tudors seem so ominously associated with its rise and fall. Was it truly a curse upon a line of kings? We may be entertained today by King Henry VIII's elaborate measures to stay one step ahead of the disease, that for him was most assuredly a mysterious curse. But in the end, his measures did work, and for all we know or may ever know, he may have been right. If you've enjoyed this episode of Ominous and Grim and want more shocking history and dark mystery, don't forget to follow this podcast, share the episode with your friends, and review us on your favorite platform. Finally, sign up at ominousandgrim.com for members-only benefits. That's OMINOUSANDGRYMM.com. And until next episode, be sure to look behind you.